let's have a look at some of these forbidden cards. So the forbidden cards are this kind of themed spells. So they're 0 mana spells that spend all your mana and do a certain proportional effect based on how much mana you spend. Now note that you don't spend all your mana for the turn unless you play it at the start of your turn. So for example, Forbidden Flame, spend all your mana, deal that much damage to your minion. So let's say you have 6 mana, you play Forbidden Flame, it does 6 damage to a minion, right? Let's say you have 6 mana, you play a 2 mana card, you have 4 mana remaining, then you play Forbidden Flame, and you deal 4 damage. So you deal 4 damage to a minion. So essentially what you're playing Forbidden Flame for is you're playing it sacrificing some damage for some flexibility. Is that good? Yes and no. I think that Forbidden Flame is a good enough card to see play in, for example, a Tempo Mage deck where you want some more low-cost spells to activate your Flame Wakers, activate your Mana Worms, and things like that, especially due to the fact that they're going to be losing Unstable Portal, which was a huge tool for Tempo Mage. And I think that Forbidden Flame, and Flame Cannon as well, is going away. So I think that looking at that, Forbidden Flame is a good way to kind of add some flexibility and add another potential either low damage spell or high damage spell, depending on what time of the game it is. But it's also not that exciting because, for example, as people have pointed out, you can play 2 mana Frostbolt, deal 3 damage. You can play 4 mana Fireball to deal 6 damage. And Forbidden Flame, you pay 4 mana to deal 4 damage, or 2 mana to deal 2 damage, which is not that exciting. And also, that damage can't hit face, it can only hit a minion. But I think that if essentially they were adding another Pyroblast to the game, that would be simply too insane for Freeze Mage. So they couldn't allow this card to hit face, I feel. With the existence of Pyroblast in the classic set, I don't think that Forbidden Flame being able to hit face would be balanced enough for the game. So unfortunately, the card is what it is, and I don't think that it's going to be changing, which is, as a Freeze Mage player, a little bit disappointing. But still, I think the flexibility of this card for Tempo Mage is good, and I think it'll see play in specifically that kind of deck, and I think it would see play over a card like Arcane Blast that requires spell damage to get any value. So I think it's not bad. I think that the ability to also use all of your mana on a turn where you otherwise might have had mana left over is really powerful. So for example, you have 4 mana and you don't want to play your Flame Waker until like 5 mana because you want to combo it with a Frostbolt or something. But if you have Forbidden Flame in your hand, you play it, you have 1 mana left over, you can kill a 1/1 or something, and you can you can activate it once, right, and clear the board. So then the next turn you can combo it with the rest of your spells on a clean board and continue just to deal damage like that. So I do think that the utility and the flexibility of it says a lot. So I'm not extremely excited about this card, but I think it's above average in both Wild and in Standard. Unfortunately, so in Arena, it's an epic, so it's not going to pop up that often. But do I think that you would pick it if it did pop up? Yeah, I do. It's another form of removal that's pretty efficient, and it's flexible, which is really great. So I think you would pick this in Arena pretty highly. Okay, here's the Priest Forbidden card. So Forbidden Shaping, spend all your mana, summon a random minion that costs that much. So I'm not going to talk about this one that much, but in Constructed, it's terrible. You would just put a minion in your deck that is going to be, of course, like 1,000,000% better than some random minion that costs the same, right? The argument is, if you're going to put a minion in your deck, then why don't you just put that minion in your deck rather than roll a 1 in 100 chance of getting that minion randomly, right? And so I think that in Constructed, this card is pretty terrible. Even with considering the efficiency or the flexibility of it, it's not good enough. In Arena, though, you would want to pick 30 of these because this is insane, right? It's essentially you can play it on any mana. You can fill out your mana curve perfectly. You would want to draft 30 of these. Like, this is an insane card in Arena. Definitely, it's a must pick. It is on the must pick level of Muster for Battle. It's just that ridiculous. So Forbidden Healing, spend all your mana, heal for double the mana you spent. it sucks. Health is a resource. Moving on. All right, so here are the neutral cards. So first one, Corrupted Healbot. So this is one of the corrupted themed things we're seeing. So we're seeing some older expansions cards or older sets cards come back as corrupted forms. Now, I've heard some other streamers kind of comment on this, and you know, they have some relations with Blizzard, so they don't want to really be like mean to Blizzard or anything like that. So they shied away from calling this lazy, but they kind of implied it, and I'm just going to call it lazy. I think that it's way too early to be seeing old cards come back in different forms, right? I mean, you see this like in Magic the Gathering all the time, right? Like there's like 8 million different forms of like Jace and all that bullshit. And it's just lazy design in my opinion. It's just extremely lazy design choice. And the cards, from what I've seen, are not really even all that exciting, and a lot of the cards are even still going to be in standard. In this case, Healbot's rotating out of standard, but a lot of the corrupted cards we're going to take a look at today are being rotated out of standard. The originals are not being rotated out of standard, and so it's just kind of awkward to play both forms in the standard format. But in this case, so 5 mana 6/6, so it's statted pretty good, of course. So of course it must have a slight downside. Of course, the death rattle of restore 8 health to the enemy hero. Unfortunately, I think that restoring 8 health to the enemy hero is just a little bit too much of a downside. With something like Zombie Chow, where you have the ability to play it on turn 1, and then you have the ability to kill it off before your opponent even takes damage, was much better than this, where you're going to play it in the mid game, where you might be trying to push for like a potential lethal or something, and you're forced to play this card, and then your opponent kills it and restores 8 health, pushing them out of lethal range, and that's really bad. So I don't think that for +1/+1 essentially in value, it's really not even +1/+1, more like +1/+0 in value. It's not enough to justify the huge downside. Now, do I think that you can do some cool things with this, like play it with Auchenai Soul Priest and Priest and deal 8 damage to the enemy hero? Of course, I think that is where we kind of see the potential for a card like this. But I also think that like, in those kind of situations, it's just too slow, and your Soul Priest, the Circle of Healing, of course, is not going to kill this off like it would kill Zombie Chow, so you're not going to be able to deal the damage immediately, and your opponent can possibly just remove your Auchenai before you get any value out of this card anyway. So because of that, I think it's just too slow. The downside is too bad, and there are much better cards to play for 5 mana, so I'm not rating this very highly in either wild or standard format. In arena, health is a little bit less important than tempo, but I still think that you would pick this card pretty lowly compared to something like Pit Fighter, which is a 5 mana 5/6. So I'm not excited. Even the mech tag doesn't really do anything anymore, especially in constructed in standard, where a lot of the mech's energy is rotating out. So I'm not excited for this card at all. It's just too bad. It's a shame. Validated Doomsayer, 5 mana 0/7. At the start of your turn, set this minion's attack to 7. So this card has like some of the coolest artwork in the entire set. Like, this card is pretty insane, right? Like, oh my god, right? But that being said, the card itself is not really all that exciting. It is, of course, extremely slow to get going. If you're winning when you play this card in Constructed, this card is pretty good. It basically guarantees that you're going to get a 7/7 on the board, and you're going to be able to use it to hit face or trade into something. If your opponent has a board, they're basically going to be able to kill this card for free, and essentially it's going to be 5 mana, heal yourself for 7, because this card is going to take at least 7 damage in order to kill it off, and potentially stave off an onslaught for 1 turn to give you a chance to draw into something that's useful or get enough mana to do something useful. But, you know, if it goes off, this is pretty insane. And one of the coolest things about this card is that it does dodge BGH, right? Because the attack doesn't go up until the start of your next turn. So on your opponent's turn, it has 0 attack, right? So they can't even kill it off with something like a BGH. However, they can kill it off with something like Shadow Word Pain. So if you're playing this against a priest, you're pretty sad if they have Shadow Word Pain, because they just dealt with your 5-mana card with a 2-mana card and gained a bunch of tempo, and that's pretty sad. So I mean, it's not a great card, but and I don't think it's going to see any real extreme play in Constructed. So I'm rating it pretty lowly in both Wild and Standard, but I think that in Arena, this card, you would pick it pretty highly. I think that the ability to get a 7/7 body for 5 mana is pretty good, and I think the chances that your opponent's going to be unable to deal 7 damage if you've been contesting the board pretty decently throughout the early game is pretty low at 5 or 6 mana, so I think that it has a pretty good chance of going off and getting some pretty good value. Okay, so Polluted Hoarder. 4 mana, 4/2, and draw a card. Now, of course, this is the corrupted version of Loot Hoarder, which is 2 mana, 2/1, draw a card. Now, the 2 health is actually a pretty big deal simply because of the fact that it's out of range of certain things like hero powers that would just easily kill off Loot Hoarder. Yeah, it draws you a card, and yeah, it has 2 more attack and 1 more health than Loot Hoarder, but I would run Loot Hoarder all day over this card simply because of the fact that it's 2 mana cheaper, and that ability to pay only 2 mana to draw a card or 4 mana to play it and ping it off just to draw a desperation card is so much better than something like Polluted Hoarder, which is a little bit overcosted in my opinion. And yeah, it contests 4 mana cards except Yetis and things like that. So it contests 3 mana cards, let's say, but it's still not really good enough, in my opinion. In Freeze Mage, for example, which is a deck that I've been playing a lot of, I would play, something more like Blood Mage Thalnos that has that additional effect of spell damage, or I would play something like Loot Hoarder simply because it's cheaper all day, just other than because the damage itself is not really important. In a lot of those decks that would run a card like Loot Hoarder or Polluted Hoarder, a lot of those decks are interested mostly in the draw effect, not necessarily in the damage or the health of the card itself. They just want that death rattle to go off. So I'm not excited about this one. I'm rating it pretty lowly in all forms of Constructed. In Arena, so a little bit different beast there. You're pretty excited to draw a card in Arena, and the fact that this would deal with a 3-drop means that you won't be excited to pick it. It's going to be a little bit below average, but I think you would pick it over bad cards any day. 4 mana, 2/4, Eater of Secrets. Battle cry, destroy all enemy secrets, gain +1/+1 for each. In Wild, this is insane because Secret Paladin is still going to be a thing in the Wild format. Now, in the standard format, it's not that great, right? I mean, you'd rather play something cheap like Kazan Mystic or something like that, because most likely you're only interested in stealing one specific secret anyway. And overall, this is going to be too... perhaps it'll see some play if secret decks become too much of a thing in Standard. If Freeze Mage becomes get some tools to become insane or something like that, you might play this simply to deny them their ice block. But again, I mean, you might run something like Kazan Mystic instead or something like that. A lot of people say it's just too slow going, and I tend to agree with them. And the fact that it gains +1/+1 for each really means that at a minimum, it really needs to destroy at least 2 secrets to really be worth the mana. Preferably destroy 3 secrets. So the only thing that this is really going to be really good against is Secret Paladin. And again, that's only going to be really a deck, at least from what we can tell right now, in the Wild format. So in Wild, I rate this card pretty highly, but again, it depends on how many Secret Paladins you're facing. If you're facing a lot of Secret Paladins, you're going to run 1 or 2 copies of this card all day. Otherwise, you ain't going to run one of these at all. And I think that the same is true for Standard. If secrets are such a problem in Standard that And again, we haven't really seen any new secrets yet come out, so it's possible that we could see some insane ones, but we're even seeing some of the secrets actually rotating out, like Duplicate, for example, or like Avenge is being rotated out of Standard. So I think that in Standard, from what we've seen right now, this card is not that great. I'm not really excited about it in Standard. In Arena, it's terrible. You wouldn't really pick this card. You can't guarantee the fact that your enemy is going to even have secrets in their deck. So, again, yeah, it's just the stats are too horrible. You wouldn't run it in Arena. Infested Tauren, 4 mana, 2/3, taunt, death rattle, summon a 2/2 slime. So the slime is a little bit better than the slime that you get off of Sludge Belcher, but the stat line for the cost of the Infested Tauren, which is essentially a corrupt version of the Tauren warrior, is really bad, right? So Sludge Belcher is notably rotating out of the Standard format because it was part of the Naxxramas expansion, which is being rotated out. However, this is not a card that you would want to run to replace it. So think about a card like Sen'jin Shieldmaster, which is one of the basic cards. It's a 4 mana, 3/5 taunt, right? So look at the stats you're getting with this one. You're getting essentially a 4 mana, 4/5 taunt split across 2 minions. So the fact that it's split across 2 minions is potentially a little bit better because it's going to take at least 2 hits or 2 somethings from your enemy to deal with it. But I still don't think that this card is good enough for the cost. I think that I would much rather hope that a new card to replace Sludge Belcher is going to come out. That's a lot better than this one. That being said, would I run a card like this over a card like Sen'jin? It really depends. I think that the fact that Sen'jin has 3 attack makes it a lot better. It tends to deal with a lot more 3 mana minions that way. Whereas 2 attack is simply just not enough to deal with a lot of the things that you're going to be coming up against at 4 mana. And because of that, I just feel that the fact that you get 2 bodies out of it is simply not good enough. You might use this entire card just to deal with 1 card from your opponent, and essentially deal with 1 card from your opponent, and it's just not good enough. Yeah, so I'm really hoping to see a new kind of Sludge Belcher that's a lot better than the Infested Tauren, simply because control decks are going to be really hurting for taunts otherwise. Basically every control deck out there right now runs some kind of like Sludge Belcher, so it's a shame that it's rotating out, and I'm hoping that we see something better than this to replace it. In Arena, again, same thing. I think it's too slow. I don't think that this card is really all that great, even in Arena. And of course, in Wild, you're not going to run this card at all, right? Because you still have access to Sludge Belcher. 1 mana, 1/1, Tentacle of N'Zoth. Death Rattle, deal 1 damage to all minions. So in Constructed and in Wild, let's just say that this card is useless because of the tools that are available. So let's rate it for Standard only. Most notably in Warrior, for example, like Grim Patron Warrior, they need a Whirlwind effect in order to generate more Grim Patrons, right? But the problem is, one of their major Whirlwind effects, Death Spite, is being rotated out of the format. So is that enough reason to run a 1 mana 1/1 card with a Death Rattle that would essentially spawn more Grim Patrons? Maybe. It depends on the other cards that come out in the set, and it depends on whether or not those cards are good enough to kind of replace Death Spite. And if not, then maybe a card like Tentacle of N'Zoth could make it into the new mid-range patron deck that exists right now. Otherwise, I just think it's not good enough. 1 mana, deal 1 damage to all minions, including your own minions, is just simply not all that exciting. Outside of Warrior, I don't really see this becoming a good card. It's essentially also rotating out, by the way, is Explosive Sheep. And Explosive Sheep would deal 2 damage to all minions for 1 more mana. So it'll be interesting to see if the 1 damage is still worth running in certain decks that can ping it off and create that whirlwind effect, like Mage, for instance. I'd actually be interested to see if a card like this makes something like Mage Patron viable. Patron Mage viable. It's interesting. It's interesting. It does give the mage the ability to generate a giant whirlwind effect, just like warrior. So I mean, it would be interesting to see if we would see something kind of like a patron mage, maybe a fun deck kind of arise from a card like this. So I'm rating it pretty lowly in standard. In wild, I think it's pretty terrible. I think that you have enough whirlwind effects in warrior already where it's not worth running. And warrior, of course, doesn't have a 1 damage hero power, so they can't deal that 1 damage by choice very easily in order to generate that whirlwind effect. But I mean, in wild, it might be worth running, and I'm not sure. Perhaps not because it's too all in against AoE, but it might be worth running something like a whirlwind or like a cruel task. No, it might be interesting to run something like whirlwind and Tentacle of N'Zoth, and you play your Tentacle of N'Zoth, you play your Grim Patron, and you play whirlwind, and or you play your Inner Rage, and then you play like your whirlwind, and you generate a bunch of patrons, and then your Tentacle of N'Zoth goes off from the whirlwind and generates more patrons, filling your board with Grim Patrons. That might be a little bit too all in against AoE, but it would be interesting to see if a card like that would be able to find a place in like a wild mid-range patron deck. So I'm not too excited about it, and I think that in Arena the effect is not good enough to justify running, unless you're in a class like Mage that can ping it off, and perhaps that's good enough, but I'm still not all that excited about it. Faceless Shambler, as I like to call it, worse Faceless Manipulator. So 4 mana, but the 1/1 doesn't matter. So essentially it's a 4 mana 1/1. Notably, this does make cards in wild like Piloted Sky Golem much worse because of the fact that you could potentially now get a 1/1 off your Piloted Sky Golem, and you're very sad about that. But of course, the Faceless Shambler has Taunt, which is interesting. And the battle cry is that it copies a friendly minion's attack and health. Yeah, usually when you're interested in copying a minion, you're more interested in copying the effect that the minion has. So that makes paying 1 more mana in order to play Faceless Manipulator much more useful. The fact that it has Taunt, I don't think is all that great. Simply because you'd be looking to play this with a big taunt minion, for example, like Ancient of War or something like that. And you can't play this card plus Ancient of War unless you've had like a Thorson discount or something like that. So I don't think that it's good enough. And the fact that if you played Faceless Manipulator, it would copy the taunt off your Ancient of War anyway. So, I mean, what are you going to do? Are you going to play like Dr. Boom and then get a 7/7 taunt minion off of it as well? I mean, that's not bad, but usually, as I said, you're interested in copying the effect. Like, for example, you look at Rambo Warlock, which is the combo Reno Warlock that runs usually Arcane Golem or Leroy Jenkins. You're interested in copying both the charge and the attack off of those, not just the attack itself. So I don't think the fact that this has Taunt, especially due to the fact that it costs 4 mana and can't really be comboed with anything 7 mana or above, I don't think it's good enough, and you're not copying the effect. So if you could, for example, play Emperor Thorson and then play Faceless Shambler and get a Taunt, that's a 5/5 and also discounts your entire hand. I think that would be absolutely insane then, but as it exists right now, I just don't think it's good enough. I think that the fact that Faceless Manipulator is still going to be in Standard as part of the Classic set means that you would play Faceless Manipulator all day before you would ever play Faceless Shambler, so it's just not that great. In Arena, it requires you to have something that's at least 4 mana or higher in play before you can even get value from this card. And it's essentially just like playing another 4 mana or 5 mana minion anyway. So if you happen to play something like a Fossilized Devilsaur on 8 and then it doesn't die, and then on 9 you play a Fossilized Devilsaur and you gain its attack and health, that's, pretty good. But I don't think that you would draft this card very highly. I think I would rate it as a below average card in Arena. Not terrible, but it's situational enough where it's not very good. Spawn of N'Zoth, Death Rattle, give your minions +1/+1, and it's a 3 mana 2/2, which is of course not all that exciting. In Constructed, it's, in my opinion, just way too slow. It's not a really great card. In Arena, you know, the effect is reasonable. However, I don't think that you can guarantee having enough minions on the board to get value out of it. You would have to have at least 2 minions on the board to even kind of get value out of this card, and I don't think that you can guarantee that enough in Arena, especially in the mid game where you would be looking to play this card, mid to late game where you would be looking to play this card, where you are going to get the value, and yeah, so I don't think it's really all that great. Cult Apothecary is the card that I think is trying to replace the Antique Healbot. The downside is it's much worse than Antique Healbot. So 5 mana 4/4 Battlecry. For each enemy minion, restore 2 health to your hero. So notably, this can restore up to 14 health to your hero if your opponent has a full board. And it does have 1 more attack and health than Antique Healbot, which is not nothing. But overall, it's just not good enough. It's you can't guarantee that you're going to be playing a class like Control Warrior, for example, generally doesn't put more than 1 minion or maybe possibly 2 minions on the board at a time. So the fact that you're only going to get potentially 0 to 4 health from this card is not good enough. They're going to play something like Alex, and they're going to lower your health to 15, and then they're just going to kill you with Grom. And the fact that you couldn't restore 8 health by playing an Antique Healbot is a big deal. So with that being said, I don't think that this is a very good card. I don't think it's going to see a lot of play unless nothing is available to really replace Antique Healbot. I think that we're going to see a lot more Reno Jackson being run if this is the replacement for Antique Healbot, simply due to the fact that the healing that we have available right now is not good enough. A lot of people are saying that we'll just run Refreshment Vendor, but of course Refreshment Vendor has the downside of restoring 4 health to your enemy as well, plus it has the downside of being restoring 4 less health than Antique Healbot. So Cult Apothecary, really not excited about it. In Arena, I'm not all that excited about it either. Your opponent isn't going to be running all that many minions on the board at once, most likely anyway. And if you're in that much of a losing position to heal like 14 health, then it's really not going to save you anyway, because you're not dealing with the board. You're just restoring your health and delaying the inevitable for 1 more turn. So it's not a great card in Arena either. Scaled Nightmare is a dragon, 6 mana 2/8. At the start of your turn, double this minion's attack. Oh, this card is really, really rough. I don't really know how to evaluate this card without seeing more, not just more of the set, but without actually trying it. It seems bad, but it is a 6 mana card with 8 health, which is something. And if it survives 1 turn, it's going to be a 6 mana 4/8, which is not nothing. I mean, that can deal with a lot of cards out there. 4 attack is enough to deal with a lot of cards out there. And if it survives another turn, it becomes an 8/8, but it also becomes BGHable at that point. I think that this card will probably see the most play, of course, in Dragon decks. But is it good enough to warrant a spot in a deck like Dragon Priest, for example, that has a lot of Dragon synergy, but also just has a lot of really, really good Dragon cards already? And I just don't see a place for this card in those specific decks. Now, I play a lot of Malygos Warlock, and Malygos Warlock is actually one of my favorite decks to play in Hearthstone, and I think that this is just way too slow and not good enough. And the fact that it can essentially be killed for free if your opponent has a lot of high attack minions on the board makes this just not a very exciting card. So overall, I'm not really all that excited about this card in both the standard and wild formats. In Arena, yeah, it's also just the attack is too low. It's too slow to get going. For 6 mana, you can do much better. Okay, so here is another one of the corrupted cards, Hager Doom of Elwyn. So whenever this minion takes damage, summon a 2/2 Null with Taunt. Okay, so basically what this card is it's a direct counter to Cthun. We haven't taken a look at Cthun yet. We're gonna look at Cthun at the end of this slideshow. But spoiler alert, Cthun deals a bunch of damage randomly to minions and to face based on how much attack and health it has. when it's played at 10 mana. So the fact that if your opponent is playing a Cthulhu deck, and if Cthulhu is, enough of a scourge in the meta, I think that a card like Hager is going to be absolutely insane, because whenever it gets hit with one of Cthulhu's missiles, it's going to generate a 2/2 with Taunt. And the fact that you can essentially fill your board with 2/2s and then do something like kill one of them and BGH Cthulhu, that's insane. So I think that specifically if Cthulhu is absolutely a huge scourge in the meta, which it very well might be in the beginning of the first season when this set is released, because everyone's going to get Cthulhu and one free pack of Whispers of the Old Gods for free when the expansion releases. Cthulhu might be enough of a plague where people will actually run Hager just to counter it and just to troll people, right? But if it's not, I don't think that this card in the stat line of 6/6 is good enough in order to justify running it in any other kind of meta. In Arena, this card is actually not bad. I think that considering a lot of legendaries in Arena are pretty situational and terrible, Hager is not a horrible one. So I think that you would pick this pretty highly over the crap legendaries in Arena. Boogie Monster. This card is terrible. Oh my god. So most notable comparison to this card in Constructed is Gruul, which of course many people think is way too slow to get going, and it of course dies to BGH. This card is much similar to that. So 8 mana, 6/7, so the stats alone are pretty bad. And it has the ability to then kill something on the next turn and grow to an 8/9. Or like an 8/7 or whatever, based on, however, of course the health is going to be based on what it kills, but that is pretty bad because your opponent can simply kill it off before you even get a chance to get any effect out of it, and the fact that it only has 7 health is not all that exciting. The fact that it doesn't die to BGH right away is something, but the fact that 6 attack is not going to be able to take out a high health minion is pretty bad. And the fact that you can hit something, not kill it, without at least using another card, and then your opponent just BGHs it on the next turn because it's at 8 attack is pretty shitty. Now, with that being said, I do see some kind of possible use for Boogie Monster in that you simply run it to draw removal, and then you play Cthulhu and you deal a bunch of damage. So it's possible that you would see Boogie Monster run in some kind of Cthulhu deck simply because it's a threat, but at 8 mana, I still think it's way too slow. So even though I think it could see some potential as some kind of removal bait, I don't think it's good enough. I think that there are going to be more, reasonable cards to play that can draw removal for Cthulhu, and then you play your 12/12 Cthulhu, and it deals 12 damage, and then it survives and deals another 12 damage to face. But yeah, Boogie Monster is just not good enough to be that card. In Arena also, it's terrible. You wouldn't pick this card. Yeah, 8 mana is just, it's too late game. The attack is too low. The health is too low. Just meh all around. Mukla, Tyrant of the Veil. So 6 mana, 5/5, so it must have a pretty good effect, right? Battlecry, add 2 bananas to your hand. So assuming that the bananas are the same bananas as they are now, which are give +1/+1 to a minion for 1 mana, that's not bad. Essentially, you're getting a 6 mana 7/7, which is better than War Golem, so not that terrible. And you're able to spread the stats out as you please amongst all your minions. So that's really good. I don't know exactly which deck that this would fit into right now. I can see it being run in spell-based combo decks like Tempo Mage, for example, simply because that the 1 mana spell is good enough to activate Flame Waker and Mana Worm and things like that. So it might see a lot of play in something like a Tempo Mage deck, which is pretty cool to see another card that generates spells for you. So, of course, this is the opposite of the old Muklo, which would give bananas to your opponent. So, you know, I'm actually pretty excited for this card. I think that this one will see some situational play in a deck like Tempo Mage. So, in Standard, I rate it as a above average card a little bit, and I think that in Wild it would also be played possibly in Tempo Mage, so a little bit above average. In Arena, I think that, yeah, you would definitely pick this card in Arena as well. I think it's an above average legendary in Arena. Again, looking at the other legendaries that you have to choose from, a lot of them are pretty bad, so Mukla is actually a reasonable choice. Okay, N'Zoth, the Corruptor, 10 mana, 5/7, Battle Cry. Summon your death rattle minions that died this game. So let's talk about Standard for a moment. So in Standard, a lot of the really good death rattle minions are leaving. So everything from GVG, your Piloted Sky Golem, your Shredder, all of those are leaving, right? So the fact that all of your cards from Naxxramas, so your Sludge Belchers, your Fugan Stalag, all of those cards are leaving. So in Standard, this card is not that exciting. Yeah, you can bring back Sylvanas, and that's pretty good, but is it good enough to run a 10 mana 5/7? Maybe not. In some kind of Fatigue Warrior deck or something like that, you might run N'Zoth the Corruptor, simply if you're running something like Sylvanas or some other kind of Death Rattle minion like a Taunter or something like that. However, looking away from Standard, looking at Wild, this card is insane. You have access to all the really, really good Death Rattle minions, your Shredders, your Sky Golems, your Sludge Belchers, all of those things. Fugan Stalag, you can summon more Thaddiuses. That's crazy. You could potentially summon up to 3 Thaddiuses in a game. That's ridiculous, right? So the fact that you have all of those combos available makes this crazy in Wild. Absolutely ridiculous. This is an insane card in Wild. But in Standard, it's not as good, but, you know, it might still potentially see some kind of play. I personally am really excited, though, to try this card out in Wild, in some kind of, like, a Raptor Rogue deck, or, like, a Death Rattle Hunter, or, not necessarily a Death Rattle, a Feign Death Hunter, or something insane like that, and you can just generate value for days, right? Of course, this card is really slow to get going at 10 mana, but still, I mean, at that point, it's ridiculous. In Arena, you're going to pick this card if you've drafted some Death Rattle minions, because the value you can generate out of this card is insane. Not only are you bringing back the stats of the minion that died, you're bringing back the powerful Death Rattle effect as well. And that makes this card ridiculous. So I'm pretty happy about this card. I think it's a great addition to the Hearthstone army, as it were. Okay, so let's take a look at the Cthun cards to wrap it up. So Cthun is a 10 mana 6/6, but of course we're going to be looking at some other cards that have the ability to buff Cthun. So ideally you're going to try to get Cthun to at least 10 attack and 10 health. So you're going to try to buff it. So most of the buff cards do are +2/+2, so you're going to try to buff it at least twice, because a lot of other Cthun synergetic cards activate when Cthun is at 10 attack and 10 health. Now, it's also worth noting that the Cthun Cultist cards will buff Cthun whether it's in your hand, in your deck, or on the field. It doesn't matter where Cthun is, Cthun will get a buff when you play one of the Cultist cards. And we haven't seen if there's going to be like spells or something that buff Cthun, or if there's going to be any more insane minions, because not all of the Cthun synergetic cards have been released yet. However, from what we've seen so far, it's going to be pretty easy to get your Cthun up to 10 attack at least. And so when you play it at 10 mana, 10/10, it's going to deal 10 random damage across the enemy board, or so hitting minions or hitting face. And that alone is pretty good. It's essentially a little bit better Avenging Wrath, and you're going to put a 10/10 body on board and force your opponent to have some kind of answer to it. So that's pretty insane. So we've talked a lot about before in Hearthstone, where because cards like BGH exist, because cards like Siphon Soul exist, because cards like that exist, big minions have to do something other than just be big. That's why cards like War Golem, a 7 mana 7/7, are just terrible, because essentially your opponent's going to answer it with like a 3 or 5 or 6 mana card, and then you're going to be really sad. So essentially they're getting more value and more tempo. So BGH, for example, right, of course, is the easiest example. BGH is 3 mana at current. So let's imagine that no change happens to BGH. So for 3 mana, they're destroying your 7 mana minion if you're playing War Golem, right? And they're putting a 4/2 body on board. Not only is that great value, that's also great tempo. So as we've said, big minions have to do more than simply be big, and I think that this effect is pretty insane enough to can be considered big enough. So what kind of decks are going to run Cthulhu? I think, of course, the most obvious examples are Priest and Warrior, because a Cthulhu deck is looking to go to the late game, and something like Cthulhu and the hero powers of Warrior and Priest, of course, make it very easy to get to the late game because they restore health, essentially. But I don't think it needs to be limited to those decks. I think that Cthulhu could potentially be run in something like even a Reno Jackson Warlock deck, for example, where you would just run one copy of all of the cultists as pretty decent mid-range cards, and then you would run Cthulhu as a huge finisher, and you would have Reno, of course, to restore health. And I think the fact that the Reno deck is going to be losing Fugit and Stalag, you could potentially take out some other cards. It's also going to be losing Sludge Belcher, by the way. And Dark Bomb. Oh god, now I'm getting sad. So you can potentially take out a bunch of cards that are being lost to Standard and just put in Cthun Cultists in their place, and then put in Cthulhu, and you have an amazing finisher. And I even think like the current Elise Starseeker deck in Warrior is pretty well tuned for Cthulhu, because they're going to be losing things like the Shield Maiden and whatnot, and you can simply pull them out, replace them with Cthulhu Cultist cards, and then you put Cthulhu in there along with Elise Starseeker, and now you have like a bunch of opportunities to win the game. So I think Cthulhu is going to be a really, really great addition for control decks, and it's just a really awesome card. And I heard other streamers that got to see the preview talking about there's a really cool effect when you play one of the cultists and it buffs Cthulhu. It creates like a really cool effect on the game board. So I'm really excited to see what that looks like. I haven't been able to see it yet. It might be out there on the internet already. I'm not sure. I just haven't seen it, but I would really like to see that. I think it's going to be really cool. I'm looking forward to playing it in Warlock. I'm looking forward to playing it in Warrior. I'm sure Priest is going to play with it as well. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting. And the fact that all players will receive Cthulhu for free when the expansion is released is going to mean that a lot of people are going to be playing Cthulhu, I think, simply because a lot of players are free to play players. So we might start seeing a lot of Hoggers popping up as the perfect counter to Cthulhu, simply because everyone's going to be playing Cthulhu, right? So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the meta, but I think that at least in the beginning of the expansion, we're going to see a lot of Cthulhu. So let's have a look at the cultists. So the first one, Beckoner of Evil, 2 mana, 2/3. So already the stats are, on par with something like a Flame Juggler that deals 1 damage to a random minion. Of course, this one is a Battle Cry, which gives your Cthulhu +2/+2 wherever it is. So the stats are reasonable. The effect is essentially deal 2 damage at some point in the game, at least 2 damage, maybe 4 damage or more. So I think that this is a pretty good card, and it's nice to see that the Cthulhu Cultist cards are actually well statted. So that means that you're not sad to play a bunch of Cthulhu Cultist cards because of their poor stats, because the stats, and I'll give you a little sneak preview into the future here. The stats for the Cthulhu Cultist cards are universally pretty damn good, which is really, really encouraging. So I'm happy to see that. Oh, by the way, it's worth noting that the Cthulhu and the Cthulhu Cultist cards will not appear in Arena, simply because, you can't guarantee that you're going to get all of that kind of synergy in Arena. So you won't be seeing these cards in Arena, but in Constructed, in both the Wild and Standard decks that happen to run Cthulhu, I think that, of course, this card is really good. It's necessary, right? You're going to run it. Twilight Elder, 3 mana, 3/4. So again, the stat line is very reasonable. So of course it's actually better than Imp Gang Boss, but of course it doesn't have the effect that spawns a 1/1. But at the end of the turn, you give your Cthulhu +1/+1 wherever it is. So as long as this survives at least one turn, you're giving your Cthulhu +1/+1. If it survives 2 turns, you're giving it +2/+2. So overall, I think that this card is really reasonable. It has a decent chance of surviving 2 turns because of its high health. So you're going to take out your opponent's 3/2, and then it has 1 health left over. And if your opponent doesn't have a 1 damage hero power, there's a pretty damn high chance it's going to survive another turn. So this card will, on average, probably give your Cthulhu like +1.5, and that's pretty good. So yeah, essentially 3 mana, 3/4, deal 1.5 damage at some point in the game. Yeah, not bad. Cthulhu's Chosen, 4 mana, 4/2, Divine Shield. Now, it's worth noting that the Divine Shield is actually really, really good. Some zoo decks before were running the 3 mana, 3/1 Scarlet Crusader Divine Shield. The fact that this has 2 health makes it insanely more valuable because your opponent can't simply run something into it and then ping it off. It just doesn't, it won't work, right? They have to be able to run something with at least 2 attack into it in order to kill it off. So that's good in that it takes more damage from your opponent in order to kill it off. More of an investment, right? And of course the battle cry, give your Cthulhu +2/+2 is pretty good. Alright, the Scrum Cultist, 6 mana, 7/6. Battle cry, give your Cthulhu +2/+2. So, of course, the 7 mana, of course, you're going to look at it and say, this is bad because it can be BGH'd or whatever. But actually, I think that's a good thing, and let me explain why. So, in a Cthulhu deck, you want to play Cthulhu somewhere after turn 10, and you want to deal a bunch of damage to your opponent through the missiles. But ideally, you also want your Cthulhu to survive afterwards in order to deal more damage to face. So you want to be able to lure out all of your opponent's removal before you play Cthulhu. So I think the fact that the Scrum Cultist has 7 attack is not a horrible thing, because depending on the board state that your opponent has at the time you play it, you may force something like a BGH to come out and take care of it, meaning that they can't use that easy answer for Cthulhu later, which I think is huge. And I think in a Cthulhu deck, you might actually run 2 of these simply for that reason. 6 mana, 7/6 is not bad stats. It can actually trade up with a 7 mana card like War Golem, or in Wild, something like a Dr. Boom. And it could possibly even bait removal, which is huge. And I think the fact that you're looking to use Cthulhu as a finisher is enough reason to run a card like this that would bait the removal and give it a higher chance to be able to deal that extra 10 damage or that extra 12 damage or whatever it is. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the synergetic cards. So in Druid, we have this 4 mana 4/5 Battle Cry. If your Cthulhu has at least 10 attack, you gain 5. This card gains 5 plus 5 health, so it becomes a 4 mana 4/10. Now, I don't need to tell you guys that that's freaking crazy, right? Now, of course, that can be silenced or whatever, but if you don't have a silence, like a 4 mana 4/10 is absolutely ridiculous. It's going to take, on average, so going up against other 4 mana cards, on average, it's going to take at least 3 hits from another 4 mana card in order to take it out. That's crazy, and I think the fact that Druid is going to be probably the class that's most likely to see some kind of nerf, probably to at least Savage Roar, possibly Force of Nature as well. Swipe could possibly be nerfed, I don't think so, but Druid is probably the class that's going to see the most nerfs when Standard is released, so I think that they're probably actually going to need a card like this in order to kind of stay competitive. Now, of course, that means that you have to run Cthulhu in Druid, and is Cthulhu going to be worth running in Druid over all the other standard Druid things, you know, like the Darnassus Aspirants, the Druid of the Claws, you know, the Ramp, right? And I don't know, maybe this card is good enough at 4 mana 4/10 where you can run Cthulhu. So obviously, if you're running a Druid Cthulhu deck, you're going to run this card. There's no question. But the question is this card good enough to justify running a Cthulhu deck and taking out some of those other, you know, generally really good Druid cards like Druid of the Claw and things like that? And I'm not sure. It'll be, I need to see the rest of the set before I could make a call like that. But this card on its own is insane. So if you're running a Cthulhu deck, you're 100% putting this into your Druid. No questions asked. Ancient Shield Bearer. So basically what we're seeing is Control Warrior's gonna run Cthulhu, because a card like this, so Battlecry, if your Cthulhu has at least 10 attack, you gain 10 armor. That is insane. Yeah, it costs one more mana than Shield Maiden, but it also has +1/+1 more than Shield Maiden. It still doesn't get BGH'd, and you get 10 armor from it. And as we said, you really only have to buff Cthulhu twice in order to get to 10 attack, right? So the chances that you're going to be able to gain 10 armor before turn 7 is pretty high. And I think that this card is ridiculous. And I think that seeing the quality of a card like this and seeing the quality of a card like Cthulhu means that Control Warrior is going to want to run Cthulhu. So I think that most of the Control Warrior decks we see during the era of Whispers of the Old Gods, at least from what I can see right now, are going to be Cthulhu decks. And this is just one example. I'm sure we'll see some other examples in the future. Alright guys, that does it for part 1 of the Whispers of the Old Gods review, so stay tuned. I'm probably going to put up another one in a few days to a week from now, so stay tuned for that, and we'll review some more cards. So next time it's not going to be nearly as many cards as it was this time, so it'll go a lot faster, but hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did enjoy the video, please like and subscribe, and if you didn't enjoy the video, please like and subscribe anyway. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.